Hello, welcome to week 4 in Australian human rights. This week we talk about Indigenous rights in Australia. Today we talk about the situation of Indigenous people in Australia at the current time. We talk about historical disadvantage and the history of Indigenous rights in Australia. I talk a little bit about Indigenous activism, and then we talk about the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. Indigenous people in Australia are significantly disadvantaged even today. There's an 8-year difference in life expectancy, so Indigenous people live on average 8 years less than non-Indigenous people. Young Indigenous people are 17 times more likely to be in detention on any given night than young non-Indigenous people. The income for Indigenous people on average is 33% lower than for non-Indigenous people. Educational outcomes are worse. 65% of Indigenous people between 20 to 24 at an HSC or equivalent, compared to 89% of non-Indigenous people. And external causes of death, including suicide, accidents, poisoning and assault, accounted for 15% of Indigenous deaths compared to 6% for non-Indigenous Australians. This disadvantage is a result of history and the historical situation of Indigenous people. It started off with terra nullius when the English came to Australia and decided that the land was empty. Terra nullius literally means empty land. Anglo people then proceeded to steal the land that belonged to Indigenous people, also stole their children and tried to assimilate them. Indigenous people didn't have citizenship rights under the federal government until 1948. Although they were welcome to fight in both World War I and World War II. There was segregation all throughout Australia until the passing of the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975. So, like in South Africa, in Australia, Indigenous people were not allowed to sit with non-Indigenous people in cinemas. They were segregated in pubs. They were segregated in swimming pools and public facilities and in shops. They were discriminated against in housing and in employment as well. This history has led to the disadvantage that continues today. However, Indigenous people have always fought for their freedom, and there is also a long history of Indigenous activism in Australia. There was resistance to the English arrival in the 18th and 19th century, including a major war between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Tasmania. It was only recently, in the late 1980s, that this resistance to English settlement was actually recognised in Australian history, and Henry Reynolds started basically the recognition of this resistance in academic Australian history circles in the late 1980s. In the 1930s, there was a large amount of activism, Indigenous activism, and in 1938, Indigenous people first decided that January the 26th was a day of mourning for Indigenous people. In 1965, like the rest of the world, there were fights for civil rights, including freedom rides, strikes, and Indigenous activism in the cities and the countryside. And in 1972, there was the Aboriginal Tent Embassy outside Parliament House. 1992, the Mabo decision was made when terra nullius was seen to be a false premise. So let's look at a bit of this activism. In 1965, Charlie Perkins and a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students from the University of Sydney hopped on a bus in Sydney and went on a tour around the country New South Wales, looking to destroy discrimination and to bring to the attention of city people the discrimination that existed in country towns. Most famously, the students arrived in a place called Moree in western New South Wales, and whilst there they gathered some Indigenous children from the local Indigenous community and they took them to the swimming pool. Up to this time, Indigenous children were not allowed in the swimming pool, but because there were cameras from the city there, they were allowed in on this occasion. The mayor of Moree decided that he would get rid of the colour band for the swimming pool in Moree, but as soon as the students left, the colour band was reinstated. So the students went back and there was a confrontation in Moree between the students and between the local population. The result of this, they also went to several other towns, and because they gathered so much publicity, the issue of Indigenous disadvantage was highlighted to people in the cities of Australia who didn't realise this was going on. In 1966, there was another major action by Indigenous people when they walked off the farm or the station or cattle property of Wave Hill in the Northern Territory. The Gurunji people walked off because they weren't receiving equal wages, and they went on strike, and it was the longest strike in Australian history. It was also the start of the Indigenous land rights movement, and basically when the Gurunji walked off, they settled in a traditional spot which was part of the property of the English landowner, and they claimed that property as their own. And this was the beginning of Indigenous land rights in Australia. One of the most significant things about this particular action was that it not only brought publicity to the issue of the terrible wages and conditions that Indigenous workers suffered, it also joined together Indigenous people in the country and in the outback with activists in the cities, and combined they managed to actually get the government, the federal government, to recognise that the land was Indigenous land. Of course, one of the most enduring symbols of Indigenous rights is the Indigenous flag, the Aboriginal flag, which was designed in 1971 by Harold Thomas, who actually owns the copyright of the flag. It was actually originally designed for the use in the land rights movement and use at the Tent Embassy in 1972. And this is a picture of the current Tent Embassy in Canberra. When I was in Canberra a few months ago, I took this picture, and as you can see, the Tent Embassy continues. It started off as the land rights movement. This is outside Parliament House, old Parliament House in Canberra, and it continues to today. So it started in 1972 and has been an almost continuous presence outside the old Parliament House in Canberra since then. So the United Nations recognises that Indigenous people need special protection and support. So there is a declaration on the rights of Indigenous people, and this declaration includes rights to cultural property, land rights, recognition of autonomy in decision making, which means that Indigenous people should make decisions for themselves, freedom from discrimination in all areas of social welfare, health, government, housing, and also includes education, including in Indigenous languages, which is something the Howard government was very much against. And at some stage they stopped that in outback communities. And in fact, the Howard government actually voted against this declaration in the United Nations. because they thought it was placing Indigenous customary law above the national law. But in countries that have agreed to this declaration, nothing like that has happened, obviously. So I suppose the question is what happens from here? There are calls for a treaty between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And of course, in New Zealand, there was a treaty between the Maori and the English. There's been a suggestion that there should be an Indigenous Assembly to advise Parliament. There's also people saying we should just vote in more Indigenous people in Parliament. There's always activism outside Parliament in terms of protest. And of course, there's always, there was a statement from the Heart as well, from Indigenous people, which supported the idea of having an Indigenous Assembly to advise Parliament and parliamentary laws. That as yet hasn't been accepted by the current government. And the news isn't all bad. I mean, the situation of Indigenous people in Australia is improving, but it's not improving in real significant ways, as we could see from the statistics that I showed at the beginning of this lecture. So there is a long way to go in terms of achieving equality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Australia. So I think as Australians, we have to continue working on it.